Brian Jones's death by misadventure. Why did the Rolling Stones fire Brian Jones, and what events lead up to his untimely death in 1969 at the age of 27? This is the tragic story of a giant talent who started off with the same traditional English upbringing as his counterpart Mick Jagger. They cross paths, begin their journey together, yet at some point take different turns and their lives couldn't turn out more different. However, there are betrayals and deceptions along the way that come into play that are often overlooked. While unravelling some of Brian's highs and lows, there are some valuable lessons to take away as he seems unable to handle the pressures and unwilling to accept the changes of being a Rolling Stone. Was Brian Jones an intoxicated egomaniac that threw it all away, or a musical genius pushed aside and then ruthlessly fired before his early death?
What were you doing before you joined?
Well, just sort of bumming around waiting for something to happen, really. I had quite a few jobs and I was trying to get a band going, but it was unsuccessful until I met up with Mick and Keith, and then
Where you went?
that was a successful band.
Well, can you think back to your first engagement? Where was that?
Marquee, Oxford Street, London.
And may I ask how much you got paid for that assignment?
20 quid, which was good because 6 months later we were still working for 10 quid.
There will never be another Brian Jones, period. He influenced music, fashion, creating the rebellious bohemian anti-establishment figure of the 1960s that future generations still emulate. But most of all, he was a brilliant musician. A multi-instrumentalist musician who mastered the slide guitar, harmonica, flute, sitar, saxophone, marimba, recorder, mellotron, kazoo, harpsichord, Appalachian dulcimer, and on and on. He is described as a wizard of sound, a troubled soul, but for a flash in time, he was a brilliant musician, a leading figure of the British invasion. Why would the Rolling Stones decide to fire such a brilliant musician that added so much depth to their music? There were two Brians. One was introverted, shy, sensitive, deep thinking. The other was a preening peacock, gregarious, artistic, desperately needing assurance from his peers. He pushed every friendship to the limit and way beyond. Bill Wyman. It's London 1962. Brian Jones is working odd jobs and playing in a band around London's blues and jazz clubs. He is a father by age 16 and will go on to father 3 more children by different women by age 23. Jones is highly intelligent, yet has a rebellious streak that grows to dominate his life. While playing in early bands such as Blue Incorporated, he uses an alias, Elmo Lewis, inspired from his blues hero Elmore James, nicknamed King of the Slide Guitar. Brian is playing the slide guitar when Mick Jagger and Keith Richards spot him at Ealing Club, completely mesmerised by his playing ability, and approach him afterwards. They discuss their love of American blues, and soon Mick and Keith begin playing with Brian and Ian Stewart, the pianist for the band. They get an apartment together, while Mick attends London School of Economics. Soon Brian is calling and booking them gigs. When asked the band's name, Brian calls them the Rolling Stones, which he gets from the Muddy Waters song Rolling Stone. Brian is the embodiment of Oscar Wilde's Dorian Gray, paying careful attention to his attire and appearance, a strong sense of style which sets him apart visually from his bandmates while playing a contrasting working-class blues music. This dichotomy earns him a local following, and he is initially the most popular member of the band with the girls.
I remember a million things about Brian Jones. He formed the band. It was his band. He started the Rolling Stones. He was the first man to play slide guitar in England. He was probably one of the first young kids to play harmonica. He loved blues and rhythm and blues. That's why the band played that in the early days. And he was the most popular member of the band with the girls, the fans. They loved him. You know, Mick came second in those days.
However, Mick Jagger begins getting a lot of attention when the audiences catch on to his unpredictable moves once he begins experimenting with what he picks up from Little Richard. The never-before-seen performances earn them disdain from the media and the parents, but the young people cannot get enough. Girls scream in delight at the energetic performances often described as sexual in nature. Mick is engaging the audience in a voyeurism into his unpredictable bad boy mindset, pushing the limits like never before. The electrifying rebellion is felt everywhere they go.
As a singer and doing a performance, you've got to be very finely attuned to what's going on in the audience. little Richard literally taught me this stuff. I watched how he would harangue the crowd almost. He would tease me. Everybody stand up. I said stand up. You know, and they would. He was outrageous. It kept it all alive, you know, and you never quite knew what was going to happen.
Their manager, 19-year-old Andrew Oldham, who had been working for Brian Epstein, comes up with a genius idea as their bad boy image, the anti-Beatles. They would be the bad guys, the antithesis of their Merseyside counterparts, the guys pushed around by society and fighting back with bad attitudes and long hair. Oldham moves Stewart from piano to roadie as he does not fit the image. Ironically, it will be the Beatles who provide the anti-Beatles with their first hit single with I Wanna Be Your Man in 1963. We knew the Beatles by then, and we were rehearsing, and Andrew brought Paul and John down to the rehearsal. They said they had this tune. They were really hustlers then. I mean, the way they used to hustle tunes was great. Hey Mick, we've got this great song. So they played it, and we thought it sounded pretty commercial, which is what we were looking for, so we did it like Elmore James or something. I haven't heard it for ages, but it must be pretty freaky because nobody really produced it. It was completely crackers, but it was a hit and sounded great on stage. Mick Jagger. In 1964, the Rolling Stones released their debut album of mostly blues covers, The Rolling Stones, with their version of Buddy Holly's Not Fade Away. It is a reflection of the 60s British blues movement, and Brian's musical influence still felt on the band. Oldham recognizes that for the Stones to continue, they will need to write their own hit songs. He assigns Jagger and Richards the task. While Brian still sees himself as the quasi-leader of the Rolling Stones, this is where the shift in power begins. In 1965, Jagger and Richards find their magic formula with their hit single, The Last Time, inspired by a gospel song by the Staples Sisters. It gave us a level of confidence, a pathway of how to do it, and once we had done that, we were in the game. There was no mercy because then we had to come up with the next one. We had entered a race without even knowing it. Keith Richards. Brian continues to contribute musically by experimenting with a range of instruments that bring colour to songs that might have felt like a typical pop song. But he begins struggling to understand his place within the new direction of the sound his rhythm and blues band is taking.
My ultimate aim in life was never to be a pop star. I enjoy it, with reservations, but I'm not really sort of satisfied, either artistically or personally.
In 1965, while in Munich the band meets 60s it girl, Anita Pallenberg, she is instantly drawn to Brian and they begin a tumultuous relationship. Living together while falling in love, they begin to dress alike, she cuts and dyes his hair to make him look more like her. They begin a flamboyant creative 2-year journey, and she becomes a fixture of the band behind the scenes, having a big influence on the band's public persona. Brian saw her as his female counterpart, and was able to use her strengths to lift up his weaknesses, giving him more leverage with the public and, more importantly, the band. When Keith first meets Pallenberg, he describes the moment, "The first time I saw Anita, my obvious reaction was, what the F is a chick like that doing with Brian?" Keith recalled later. Anita's incredibly strong, a much stronger personality than Brian, more confident with no reservations, whereas Brian was full of doubts. Meanwhile, Mick and Keith are churning out hits they write together, including Satisfaction, Get Off My Cloud, Paint It Black, and Ruby Tuesday. The dominant force behind the music is shifting to the band's songwriters, and Brian turns to harmful substances to escape the feeling of rejection, which creates a further divide amongst the former inseparable Flat and bandmates. During this period, some of Brian's notable contributions include sitar on Paint It Black. Most rock fans first heard proper sitar playing on Paint It Black thanks to Brian Jones. Recorder on Ruby Tuesday. While fooling around with the recorder, a fairly basic woodwind instrument, he crafted a melody that eventually became Ruby Tuesday. Jones went uncredited.
No one knows. She comes and goes.
Mellotron on She's a Rainbow. Alternatives were sought out by bands looking to diversify their sound. The Mellotron was an early keyboard, with different settings that could emulate different instruments. Jones is on the Mellotron, contributing some of his finest work to Jones plays kazoo on Cool, Calm and Collected, saxophone on Dandelion, and the Appalachian dulcimer, a folk instrument that gave Lady Jane a distinct pastoral feel. Oldham later claims in his book, Stoned, that Brian Jones was jealous and tried to desperately hold on to his power. This fear of losing control sends Brian spiraling into depression. Some report his violent temper growing over the next 2 years. There is no question that a storm is brewing inside of Brian.
Never in my sweet short life have I been so sad before.
Let's face it, the future as a Rolling Stone is very uncertain.
(1967). The Rolling Stones leave to Morocco without Brian Jones, the fateful trip destined to derail Brian's future in the band. It begins with Keith and Mick, who are with a group of friends when they get raided, and there is a media frenzy that surrounds the band's drug bust for months, so Oldham decides to send the band to Morocco until things calm down. The original plan for Brian, his girlfriend Anita, and Keith Richards to drive to Morocco from France changes when Brian becomes sick and has to be hospitalized. Keith and Anita take the trip together without Brian, with plans to meet up with him there once he is better. Anita, who had been growing weary of her relationship with Jones, who is abusive and difficult to live with as his drug use increases, falls right into Richard's arms as he is a shoulder for her to cry on. Keith and Anita meet up with couple Mick Jagger and Marianne Faithfull once in Morocco. Brian, determined to not be left behind, recovers from his illness and eventually catches up to the band and soon realizes that Anita has turned cold on him. In a highly dramatic confrontation, Brian corners Anita, who confesses that she has fallen for Keith. Brian violently lashes out at her. Keith takes Anita and the band, and they leave and return back to France, leaving Brian behind. Brian stays in Morocco and slips into a drug-filled stupor as he comes to the realization that he has lost his girlfriend to his friend and bandmate, and on top of that, he is also losing his band, the one thing he has to live for. Even though he is not in his right mind, Jones could see the reality of the situation. Jones broke down into uncontrollable tears and needed a sedative to sleep at night. Keith and Anita end up moving in together. They go on to live as a couple for 12 years and have 3 children. When Brian returns, he displays mood swings when with the band, often treating people with cruelty. The band continues to record, but oftentimes Brian is a no-show and they just continue and leave him out. The band's producer, Jimmy Miller, described the rest of the band as workhorses, but when it came to Brian showing up sporadically, the others, particularly Mick and Keith, would often say to me, "Just tell him to piss off and get the hell out of here."
A flavour, but his involvement in the band dwindled.
Keith and I took drugs, but Brian took too many drugs of the wrong kind and he wasn't functioning as a musician. I don't think he was that interested in contributing to the Rolling Stones anymore.
But Brian was not the only one up to shenanigans when it came time to record. Bill Wyman said the following of the band: "Every day at the studio, it was a lottery as to who would turn up and what, if any, positive contribution they would make when they did. Keith would arrive with anywhere up to 10 people, Brian with another half a dozen, and it was the same for Mick. They were assorted girlfriends and friends. I hated it. Then again, so did Andrew, Oldham, and just gave up on it. There were times when I wish I could have done too." However, on 1968's Beggar's Banquet, Brian's contributions are plentiful and can be felt all over. At the subsequent Rolling Stones Rock 'n' Roll Circus, Brian is not fully functional and creates a further drift from reality and the band. Brian purchases Cotchford Farms, the former home of Winnie the Pooh author A.A. Milne. He is enjoying the childlike atmosphere of the home and occasionally showing up for recording sessions. Brian shows up for a photo shoot with the band on May 21st, 1969, not in his right state of mind. The band is ready to go on tour, but Brian's drug possession busts make him unable to travel with the band to the United States. 2 weeks later, on June 8th, 1969, 3 of the band members, including Mick Jagger, Keith Richards, and Charlie Watts, go to visit Brian at Cochford Farms. They inform him that they will carry on without him, and it is best if he departs the band. He seemingly agrees that this is best for all
Mick
of them.
And Keith saying, we can't go on like this, we need another guy. And we did need somebody else.
Do you remember what happened again when you went over there?
No, can't remember. But I remember it wasn't very nice.
They all agree that Brian can issue a statement on the departure. He releases the following: "I want to play my kind of music, which is no longer the Stones' music." He goes on to say that the split was amicable and that he and the Stones will remain close friends. But as he restated, the music Mick and Keith have been writing has progressed at a tangent as far as my own taste is concerned. The following day, Jagger confirms that Brian has left the band, stating, "He wasn't enjoying himself, and it got to the stage where we had to sit down and talk about it. So we did, and decided the best thing was for him to leave."
It was a very, very difficult decision to make. This is someone that you spent the beginning of the band with, and I mean, it was horrible. We said to Brian, "Look, this isn't working out," and he sort of said, "Yes, it isn't," and it was very sad.
Reportedly, Brian began connecting with old music friends to form a band and start playing again over the next few weeks. Then, less than a month later, on July 3rd, 1969, Brian and his girlfriend Anna Wallin were hanging out at the pool. Wallin eventually goes back inside. He had friends over at his house with copious amounts of alcohol and cakes baked with hashish. By 9 p.m, Jones was found lifeless in his pool where everyone was partying just hours earlier. Brian Jones, one of the biggest rock stars of the 60s, friend of John Lennon, Jimi Hendrix, creator of the Rolling Stones, revered by many, was dead. Fans were devastated and tributes poured in. Brian Jones, death by drowning or death by heartbreak.
About midnight, Jones went for a swim with his Swedish girlfriend, Anna Wallin, and another friend, Mr. Frank Thorogood. After a time, Mr. Thorogood and the girl went back to the house. When they returned, they saw Jones at the bottom of the pool, and they pulled him out.
Jones's death was ruled death by misadventure, and he drowned due to heavy intoxication. At the time of his death, Jones also had a heavily enlarged liver. The autopsy revealed that Jones died while under the influence of alcohol and drugs, and that his liver was twice the normal weight. Upon Jones's death, The Who's Pete Townshend wrote a poem titled "A Normal Day for Brian, a Man Who Died Every Day," printed in the Times. Jimi Hendrix dedicated a song to him on US television, and Jim Morrison of The Doors published a poem titled "Ode to L.A." while thinking of Brian Jones deceased. Coincidentally, Hendrix and Morrison both died within the following 2 years, with Jim Morrison's death falling on the same date as Jones's. All three died at the age of 27.
Charlie phoned me up. Phone went about 3 in the morning, and I just got off to sleep after about an hour. Charlie phoned me up, and he just said, "Brian died." I can't believe it. Then Mick flew to Australia to do Ned Kelly. Keith was working in the studio. Me and Charlie went to the funeral. When we drove through Cheltenham, all the streets were packed with people. I'd never seen anything like it. It was like a coronation or something, And all his family and relatives are all tranquilized and everything. Everybody's crying, upset. There's thousands of fans everywhere. The sad thing was that he'd left the band, and suddenly he was phoning up people and getting a band together, and he was coming up for the sessions and telling us all about what he was doing and all that. I mean, still a very good friend. And then suddenly, wham,
Just 2 days after Brian's death on July 5th, 1969, the Rolling Stones had been scheduled to perform a free concert in Hyde Park. The concert had originally been promoted weeks earlier as the first public appearance of Mick Taylor, as the band's newest guitarist. For obvious reasons, the band decided instead to dedicate their upcoming Hyde Park performance to the memory of Brian Jones.
Hyde Park was the funeral. And the bit about burying and the shovels and all of that, it's not that important to me. That was his funeral.
The Hyde Park concert was 2 days after Brian died, in front of almost 500,000 people in London.
The concert had become in his memory, when it obviously hadn't been planned like that, but it had assumed that feeling. He was the author of his own misfortunes, really. But when you look back on it now, you think, well, surely we could have done something. You know, there's something more than just that.
He got much nicer just before he died, you know, the last few years of his life. But I felt even sorrier for him for what we did to him then. We took his one thing away, which was being in a band. That's my opinion.
Today, Brian Jones is regarded as one of the most talented musicians to emerge out of the 1960s, a pioneer of sound and a fashion icon. Mick took the lead on the band and eventually even managed the band for some time. A lot of things could have been done differently. It's easy to look back and have all the answers and wonder why they just didn't do one thing or another. But rock and roll is filled with complex characters and took off during complex times. We now know so much more about the trappings of substance abuse as an escape from our problems and the destruction it can cause. Hope you enjoyed the video and found value from the story. Please share and comment if you know someone who might benefit from this story.